Welcome to episode 94 of Anchored in Education. I'm E. Scott England, and Anchored in Education is the podcast dedicated to all things education. Educators across the world routinely engage in conversations surrounding fundamentals, concepts, and new ideas that improve this great profession. Sometimes we agree, other times we disagree. But at the end of the day, we are all anchored in education. Before I get started today, I want to offer a disclaimer. This episode contains explicit language. While this is uncharacteristic for Anchored in Education, it is within the context of today's topic. I completely understand if you prefer to skip today's episode, but just know that the content of today's episode is grounded in scientific research and is not intended to be offensive. Today we welcome back Jodie Eckleberry-Hunt once again. This is Jodie's fourth time as a guest on Anchored in Education, and each time she has delivered us something fresh and new, along with practical strategies to help ourselves. You might remember that we were introduced to MOMF back in episode 79. It was a way to help us shut down negativity and manage worry and anxiety. Then, in episode 86, Jodie helped us adapt her book, Getting to Good Riddance, to help us understand how we can get rid of a bad job, a bad boss, or a bad habit. And just last month, episode 91, Jodie joined us to talk about teacher resilience, including sharing strategies that she shares with educators in her resilience workshops. She returns this month with another exciting book that is set to release, drumroll please, tomorrow. The book is Badass Stories, Grit, Growth, Hope, and Healing in the Shit Show. This is a book that Jodie has thought about writing for years, and one that, when she did write it, has become one of her favorite authored pieces she has put out to date. I can tell you, Badass Stories couldn't have arrived at a better time for me in my life. This is a book in which a reader can so closely identify to so many stories and situations, walking away realizing nothing is impossible. Jodie, welcome back to Anchored in Education for an unprecedented fourth time.
I'm excited to be back.
Well, I'm excited to have you. We've talked about this in last month's episode whenever you were talking about teacher resilience. We teased this book several times, but when we teased it, we never even gave the title. And so, hopefully the anticipation has been well worth it. I know whenever I read Badass Stories, Grit, Growth, Hope, and Healing in the Shit Show, that I absolutely love this book. And you've talked about this book for a long time. I know this is something that has been near and dear to your heart. You've wanted to write it for a long time. So let's just start with giving listeners the background to why you wrote this and what exactly is this book about?
So probably wrote it for somewhat selfish reasons in that I hear a lot of fabulous stories. But then again, a lot of the stories stick with me and are disturbing to me or haunting to me. Some are inspiring for sure, but it was a way to kind of make sense of some of the things I've learned and heard. I am a believer in post-traumatic growth, like bad things can happen, but how can we grow and learn from it? And I try to do that in my work. But one of my favorite authors over the years is Rachel Naomi Remen, and I love short stories. And when I've read her books, I thought, I want to do something like that. I want to put something out into the world that is healing for people.
Yeah.
But as I made mention in this book, it took me many, many years to write this because I always felt like I didn't measure up. My stuff wasn't going to be as good as hers. And it's not the same at all. It took a process of letting go, of using her as my measuring stick and stopping judging and just letting me be who I am.
Yeah, and when you say that it's been something in the works, I recall it's towards the beginning of the book. I want to say like 20 plus years since you first had the idea. I want to say it was early 2000s, right?
It sure was. I think I made the pronouncement around 2002 that
Yeah.
I'm going to write a book, and then didn't do a darn thing for many years.
And it was going to be called something else. It was Kitchen Island Slop.
Yes. Yes, because Rachel Naomi Remen's the first book I read was called Kitchen Table Wisdom.
Okay.
And I found myself thinking, yeah, my stuff is not that neat. It's sloppy. And so mine would be, yeah, Kitchen Island Slop.
Fun. Well, I would say that not even a delay, but the time that went from 2002 to 2023 when it's going to be released was for a reason, because you were able to fill this book with amazing stories. But now, and you even said it, when you talked about post-traumatic growth, but in the beginning of this book, you mentioned these stories can be raw. They can be in your face. And the one thing I noticed about these stories is that many don't have an ending that we know. And of course, I mean that people went about their lives and you didn't see them again. So is it difficult to invest so much time into someone, but not to get to see them through their entire journey?
For sure. But one of the first things I learned in counseling, in graduate school, one of the first things they taught us is that you can see the person sitting across from you as a victim, or you can see that person as a survivor. Mm-hmm. And if you see them as a survivor, you recognize that they've been surviving for years before they met you, and they're going to survive for years after they've met you. But if you see them as a victim, you'll see yourself as essential and the one with all the answers, and with like a power differential. And so I try to make the conscious choice to see people as survivors. And I will say that that's one of the most gratifying things about what I've done, is that there are some people who I've seen over the course of 20 years off and on. And then there's some people that I don't see again, but I have the belief, I have a deep belief that they're out there surviving.
Sure.
And hopefully plotting their own path and moving on.
And have you ever, for someone that disappears and then have they come back to share stories with you?
Yeah. And that's, again, it's when people end therapy with me, I'm always sad, and I would love to see him again, but I know if I see him again, that means they've come across another problem. So, but that's okay. I expect that. So for sure I have, and it's just wonderful to know people over the years like that. That is a privilege.
Yeah. Now, I know in the book you said that the identities and the stories, I mean, they're concealed in a way that would be difficult to identify the person. But as you were going throughout your years, when you came across a particular story, did it immediately hop into your head like, this is one that's going to be in my book? When I write that book, this is going to be in it. Did you have some of those stories?
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's where I started. Like some people who just blew my mind, either that they exceeded expectations or really highlighted my own stereotypes, but what really stood out are the people who just survived and thrived in the most horrific circumstances. That's where I started, but it was difficult to kind of narrow things down. And as you mentioned, I disguised the stories such that for some people, I combined their stories into one.
Sure.
As a way to honor more than one person who had the same issue, which that's the thing that I hope readers get, is they feel seen and heard, because the issues that other people are out there experiencing in daily life that's what we're all struggling with the courage to live life.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it's a great segue into, where I want to begin, because the timing could not have been more perfect when I received this book, because I had just received news that a publisher I was working with for a book decided to back out. I shared that with you, not in an episode, but just, when we had our conversation. Then I started reading badass stories, and part one is about grit. So all I could think about was what went wrong. But you write that, quote, true grit is forcing yourself to also look at what has gone well, what you've achieved. And I certainly, even though I got that rejection from books, had achieved quite a bit that I was just failing to see. So what can we do to build more grit capacity in our quest to become a true badass?
And what you just said is will probably resonate with the educator in you and the educators in your audience. You don't just give negative feedback to your students what they're doing wrong, because everybody would give up.
Right.
So the answer to your question is, how do you build grit? It is learning to be a better coach to yourself and catching the defeative self-talk. The self-talk that beats you up. And it's just, we all do it. And you're not, just because I tell you doesn't mean you're going to stop doing it, but it's paying attention to it and saying, okay, I got to just force myself forward. And sometimes, by the way, that's just in your behavior. Like, I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm going to do something. I don't know. I don't really have the energy, but I'm going to force myself into a behavior. And then you look around and you're in a different spot and then a different mindset.
Yeah. And, have you ever encountered, because I don't think this is just specific to me, but I find that I can really talk others through things. I can really be a motivator to other people. And then when the exact same thing hits me, I'm clueless on how to talk myself through it. I mean, is this a common experience?
Yeah, and I would challenge and say you're not clueless, you're just not practiced enough to apply it to yourself. But, so I'm the master of that spicy self-talk. What I usually say to myself is, oh my gosh, you're such a hypocrite. What would, such and such say if they knew that this is what you were saying to yourself and you say something completely different to them? And it's a way of holding myself accountable and doing them off, right?
Yeah, that's going to say spicy self-talk just screams, move on, motherfucker, to me.
It does. Exactly right.
Yeah. All right. The next section of badass stories is about growth. And so we often go all about growth in the wrong way, though. And a perfect example you give us is that we often label growth as either good or bad. And so I believe you would say that this is not a healthy way to approach growth. So what can you share with us on how we can avoid growth interruption?
And so this is the growth interruption is when you just stop, when you just give up. And so I thought about this. It's interesting today. This is sort of my imagery associated with being a parent of a teenager. I'm driving, and all of a sudden I hit a whiteout, and it's a complete blizzard. I can't see anything. I can't see the road. I can't see the lanes. I'm gripping the steering wheel like crazy and gritting my teeth. And even though I'm scared, I have to be steadfast. I have to hope that things are going to get better. I have to have, again, the faith that things are going to get better, but just saying, I got to keep moving forward because I can't stop. And I think that is what growth is. Growth is all, if you think about growing pains, it almost always is painful, but we tend to label it, the pain is bad, or we don't want it, or we avoid it. And it is when growth interruption is when we just stop showing up. We just stop trying. And it's okay to do for a day or two.
Sure.
But it's when we just completely give up that we're going to get stuck. And so when I was using the example before, that's my big growth area right now is parenting a teen. And it is just hanging on, gritting my teeth, bearing through the pain with the hope that things are going to clear up.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm right there with you, raising a teen and having the same thoughts. Now, the subtitle, we've talked about grit, we've talked about growth, and we're going to talk about hope and healing. But do you find that, while all of these are probably somewhat interrelated, growth and grit, would you say they are closely related, that you have to have the grit, or at least that mindset of grit, to be able to experience the growth?
I think it helps to have grit, which again is the never give up mindset. But grit, according to Angela Duckworth, I think, pardon me, she uses the term the passion and perseverance. I don't know that we're all passionate about growth. Sometimes it's a kicking and screaming kind of thing. But so I think it helps to have grit, but certainly we can all keep growing, and it's a different pace for different people. It's just but it does get back to that not giving up.
Yeah. And I think it's important to highlight what you just said, that growth looks different person to person. And I know that is something that I have to, I guess, check myself, because sometimes I want to grow leaps and bounds because I'm seeing others around me do the same thing. But, you can't skip steps whenever you try to grow. And I think that that's an important reminder. And so we move to the next section. We're talking stories now surrounding hope. A frightening thing to say would be that one has no hope. As I was reading the stories in this section, I realized that I never considered hope in such depth. And you succinctly describe it as, quote, hope improves the human condition. The very next sentence you pose, what I took to be a rhetorical question, is, without hope, what do we have after all? So now, if you'll let me, I want to rephrase the question to solicit a response and get out of the rhetorical. So, with hope, what do we have?
Well, I think with hope, we have the expectation of something better. And even if where we are is good, hopefully it can always be better. But no matter how bad things are, the expectation, the belief, the feeling. So I mentioned there, Jerome Grootman talks about hope. He's written a book, The Anatomy of Hope. He talks about it as a feeling, and I think it's a belief, in addition to, but a belief that things will improve. And I think that with hope, we have that.
And so I'm taken back to, I've heard someone say before, regarding a situation, whether it be in life or work or whatever, is that, well, it could always be worse. And using that as sort of a way to frame what's going on as, yeah, this sucks, but it could always be worse. But instead, couldn't we ask ourselves, but it could always be better, in terms of that hope, and being able to connect the hope to growth? And does it help to reframe it that way?
As long as you aren't doing it in a judgmental way.
Okay.
I think, so yes, I would like to, that's part of the grit, right?
Yeah.
It's saying, okay, this is, and I am queen at doing that. Like, meaning I might set a goal, but when I get that goal, I'll move the marker and say, well, but I could do this. So it's a delicate dance, right? So I think that is grit, and that's healthy. So great that things could be better, but also saying, but that was pretty darn good. Mm-hmm. Like, that was pretty awesome. How did I get there so I can take that, turn the volume up, and even take it to the next level? So as long as it's not done in a judgmental way, I think it's great.
Okay. And so the key in that is to not be judgmental of ourselves. And that goes back to me in our conversations that we've had about that negative self-talk.
It is. And in addition to kind of what you just said, taking time to acknowledge what you did well to get you to the point where you're saying, oh, but things could be better. So not just, so it is recognizing the judgmental self-talk and arguing it, but it's forcing yourself to acknowledge all the good stuff as well.
That's right. All right, before we go, Jodie, I want to point out that in true fashion with your books, you have tons of journal prompts throughout. And one that stuck out was at the beginning of the last section, which is healing. And so it was the first prompt after the introduction to the section, and it says, "How high is your anxiety after reading that intro?" And I can totally get it, though, because you mentioned that it is often our innate reaction to help people heal through fixing. But like you say, fixing is not healing. I'd like to close today by learning more about, well, what is healing then?
So hopefully this book, people will find this book healing. And I think that ultimate healing is allowing yourself to be with somebody who's in pain without feeling like you have the answer for them or that you have the power to fix it for them, but that you help people feel less alone. That is the thing I think that is most striking. What I see, people who get stuck along the way in their own journeys in life as they feel shame and doubt and isolated. They feel like no one could possibly understand or that they're too different. And just having a safe place to tell their story, to feel less alone and to feel connected. So I think healing, true healing, is accepting people and not jumping in, but just accompanying them in their pain so that for that moment, they don't feel so alone.
And so can we connect that to empathy then? And that, right? I mean, the whole thing with empathy, and I know this was in another book that I read recently, is that a lot of times, if we truly want to, display empathy, there is not a response that's needed. It's more listening, and it's that feeling of what the other person's going through. And so, to what you said, healing, to be, an empath, in that it's not coming up with a response. We don't need a response to everything that's being said.
Yeah, and you made it sound very simple.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Let's not, because we know that it definitely is not simple. So.
Yeah, empathy takes a lot of courage. That you're not going to lose yourself. The fear that sometimes we might lose perspective or lose it emotionally, but that you can have the bandwidth to be available emotionally to another person and try to feel or imagine or see the world from their perspective is not easy. And I think it's easier for people who are generally empathic, but it is difficult to do. And it takes a level of mental and emotional energy that often comes about at a time where when it's not convenient.
Sure. And to me, that's why I think, at least in my opinion, so many people jump to fixing, because it seems easier to offer a solution and, kind of like a Band-Aid to it. Here you go. This is what needs to happen. This is what you need to do. But
Checkbox, right?
Yeah. Yeah. The checkbox. Yeah. So, I guess I don't want to close quite yet without covering a last story that you had in here. And this story was kind of personal to you because it was about you. And it was about an educator that was really inspirational, kind of turning you in your, on the path you were on to where you are now. And, so at what point did you decide that you were going to tell this story, put it in the book, and why in the healing section?
I think I knew from the get-go that I had to include this story because it was so impactful in my life. And the story of how a teacher probably was empathic for me when she didn't have to be, and it completely came out of nowhere, could have fit in any of the sections. But I think in many respects, as I look back, this teacher who just pulled me aside and asked me if there was anything she could do to help me essentially be more engaged, because she felt like I wasn't living up to my potential, but she said it in a very kind way, healed me. And I think it's not that she fixed all of my problems, but she started me on a path of feeling okay with my anxiety, and maybe a path of self-reflection. Maybe that's the best way of saying it. By her asking those questions, she got me thinking, maybe I am good enough to go to college. Maybe I am smart. Maybe I had inklings I was, but I was so busy comparing myself to other people.
Yes.
And I had such high anxiety that I couldn't see it. So I wouldn't, and I think I said in the chapter, she healed me, but maybe a better way of saying it was she started me on the path of my healing.
And had there ever been an opportunity after that to be able to go back and have a conversation with her on, to show where you ended up?
So I think I did send her a copy of that part of the manuscript after it was edited. And that was the first time I went back with her. I didn't keep a relationship with her. And I think I again, partially my anxiety, since I didn't have a relationship with her, I didn't want to go back and seem like I was bragging or whatever. But in the end, I did need to say thank you and that you made a difference in my life. But I just hadn't kept contact with her. And I don't know, probably in my mind early on, even though she had made such an impact, I still felt like she was too good for me. So my point, though, for teachers, and not just teachers, but people in relationships, mentoring relationships with younger folks, is sometimes you have made a complete difference in the life of somebody, and you'll never, ever know.
And that's okay. And that's what the whole point of, just kind of, living in that, whether it's being empath or, help with the healing or, extending hope, that, doing that kind of thing, you never know the impact that you're having, and you may never know, but it sure beats having a negative impact and knowing it. So I love that you shared that story on that, what an educator did for you, and how it can be, such a difference maker, or how we can be difference makers in people's lives.
So you had asked me very early on in this interview if it's hard to not hear the end of the story. And it's all of a sudden very obvious to me that's what teachers do all the time.
It really is. That, we're fortunate to find out, some, but a lot of times we don't know all. But to think that we're only impactful to the some we hear about is completely incorrect. It's every path that we come across. The book is Badass Stories, Grit, Growth, Hope, and Healing in the Shit Show, and it comes out tomorrow on February 14th, and Turner Publishing, they can go to your website, I think, to get the link to the book, and but pretty much wherever books are sold, they'll be able to find this. Jodie, thank you so much for joining us once again on Anchored in Education. And while we may not have anything scheduled, I cannot promise that I won't have you back again. I love our conversations.
Thank you for having me. I'd love to be back.
Now, you can find Jodie on Twitter, Instagram, her website. I'll tell you what, head over to my website, escottengland.com, and click on the podcast tab that's at the top. You'll find today's website, and there you'll be able to read more about Jodie, as well as find links as to where to find her and Badass Stories. Don't forget, if you have not already, subscribe to Anchored in Education on whatever platform you get your podcasts. I do hope that our conversation today has inspired you to add badass stories to your professional or personal bookshelf. We have all heard about grit, growth, hope, and healing. I would even venture that many of us have read about each of these in some way, shape, or form. Jodie's book goes beyond just reading about each of those. It gives us stories. It shows what grit, growth, hope, and healing look like in action. It isn't always pretty. Seldom is it easy. I definitely encourage you to purchase Badass Stories when it releases tomorrow. But I want you to come back to Anchored in Education next week, because I will have a guest who is coming to share her own badass story. I love when episodes organically connect with each other. It's just one more way we can demonstrate that at the end of the day, we are all anchored in education.